Having discussed the minimum climb gradient requirements and how to ensure the aeroplane attains them, we need to focus on the obstacle clearance requirements. In JAROPS 1, it states that an operator must ensure that the net takeoff flight path must clear all obstacles by a vertical margin of at least 35 feet. If the aeroplane is unable to do so, it must turn away from the obstacle and clear it by a horizontal distance of at least 90 meters plus 0.125 times d, where d is the horizontal distance the aeroplane has travelled from the end of the takeoff distance available. For aeroplanes with a wingspan of less than 60 meters, a horizontal obstacle clearance of half the aeroplane wingspan plus 60 meters plus 0.125 times d may be used. However, obstacles further away than the values in the table need not be considered. We have seen this horizontal clearance information before when we were discussing Class B multi-engine obstacle clearance. However, there are two crucial points to consider when trying to work out the vertical clearance. The first relates to climb gradient, which, if you remember, is a ground-based gradient. In order to work out the obstacle clearance of the aeroplane, the climb gradient needs to be known. But JAROPS 1 states that the climb gradient to use for the purpose of calculating obstacle clearance must be the net climb gradient. Remember that the net gradient is the gross gradient diminished by a safety factor. In this case, the safety factor changes depending on the number of engines. In the case of 2-engine aeroplanes, the net gradient is the gross gradient decreased by 0.8%. For 3-engine aeroplanes, the net gradient is the gross gradient decreased by 0.9%. And for 4-engine aeroplanes, the climb gradient must be made worse by 1%. Using the net gradients instead of the gross gradient in the takeoff flight path will produce the net takeoff flight path as shown on screen. As we stated at the beginning, the net takeoff flight path must clear all obstacles by 35 feet. The second point to consider is the effect of wind on the ground gradient. Headwind will increase the ground gradient and improve obstacle clearance, whereas tailwinds will decrease the ground gradient and deteriorate the obstacle clearance. JAROPS 1 states that when adjusting for wind to calculate the ground gradient, no more than 50% of the reported headwind and no less than 150% of the reported tailwind must be used. Carrying out this rule simply adds another safety margin into the calculation. We stated that if the aeroplane is unable to clear the obstacle vertically, then it can turn away from the obstacle and clear it horizontally. However, there is a restriction on how much the aeroplane is allowed to turn. Clearly, it's not safe if the aeroplane needs to bank sharply to clear the obstacle by the regulatory margins. Turning can increase the effective weight by imposing extra G loads, and therefore the climb gradient is reduced and stall speeds are increased. Firstly, the aeroplane is not allowed to turn below a height of 50 feet or a height equivalent to half the wingspan. Thereafter, and up to a height of 400 feet, the aeroplane is not banked by more than 15 degrees, and from 400 feet, not banked by more than 25 degrees. JAROPS 1 does permit operators to exceed these bank angles providing the operator uses special procedures, and that these procedures have been approved by the relevant authority. The special procedures must take account of the gradient loss from such bank angles, and these must be published in the aeroplane flight manual. The maximum bank angles that the special procedures allow is up to 20 degrees between 200 and 400 feet, and up to 30 degrees between 400 and 1,500 feet. If any turn of more than 15 degrees is required at any point in the takeoff flight path, then the vertical clearance is increased to 50 feet instead of 35 feet. Manually working out the obstacle clearance capability of the aeroplane could take a long time, since there are so many points to bear in mind and the calculation itself is quite lengthy. To remind you of the complexity of these calculations, you may remember this image from the multi-engine Class B requirements. Just bear in mind that for Class A aeroplanes, it's even more complicated than this. Thankfully, most operators and manufacturers have produced either rapid lookup tables or graphs to quickly enable the pilot to work out if an obstacle in the takeoff climb will be cleared by the relevant vertical margins following engine failure. These tables or graphs will produce a mass. This mass is called the obstacle limit mass. It is the maximum mass that will allow the aeroplane, in the event of engine failure, to clear the obstacle by the relevant vertical margin. The obstacle limit mass graph shown on screen is found in CAP 698 on page 36 of section 4. We have already worked through this graph in the previous lesson. Notice that winds are included into the graph. This is important because obstacle clearance calculations must use ground gradients, and these are dependent on wind. In fact, remember that JAR Ops 1 had a rule about the wind. It stated that when using the winds to work out the ground gradient, only use 50% of headwinds and no less than 150% of tailwinds. Notice the slope of the headwind and tailwind lines. This shows that the graph applies the wind rule for you. Therefore, if you enter the graph with the actual reported wind, the graph corrects it automatically so you don't have to. Once the details of the obstacle have been entered, as shown by the example, the obstacle limit mass can be read off. And, in this case, the obstacle limit mass is 51,700 kilograms. Taking off with a higher mass than this would not ensure adequate vertical clearance. However, if this mass unduly restricts the takeoff mass, then the aeroplane may be dispatched with a greater mass, so long as the aeroplane turns around the obstacle, clearing it by the relevant horizontal margins and does not exceed the turn restrictions when trying to do so. There is only a remote or very remote chance that an engine will fail on takeoff, and therefore meeting the climb gradient and obstacle clearance requirements will not be a significant concern. However, there is one more requirement that plays a role in normal operations. As aeroplane traffic increases, there will be increasing concerns about the effect of the traffic on local communities. Therefore, most airfields near urban areas enforce some sort of noise abatement requirements. There are two such procedures. The first procedure, Noise Abatement Departure Procedure 1, is intended to provide noise reduction for noise-sensitive areas in close proximity to the departure end of the runway. The second procedure, Noise Abatement Departure Procedure 2, provides noise reduction to areas more distant from the runway end. Noise Abatement Departure Procedure 1 involves initially climbing to 800 feet above aerodrome level at no less than V2 plus 10 knots. On reaching 800 feet, adjust and then maintain engine power in accordance with the noise abatement schedule in the aircraft operating manual, and maintain a climb speed of V2 plus 10 to 20 knots with flaps and slats still in the takeoff configuration until a maximum of 3,000 feet. From 3,000 feet, and while maintaining a positive rate of climb, accelerate to en route climb speed, retracting flaps and slats on schedule. Noise Abatement Departure Procedure 2 involves initially climbing to 800 feet at no less than V2 plus 10 to 20 knots. On reaching 800 feet above aerodrome level, decrease aircraft pitch and, while maintaining a positive rate of climb, accelerate towards zero flap speed, VZF, and reduce power with the initiation of the first flap or slat retraction. Alternatively, when the flaps and slats are retracted after 800 feet, then reduce thrust and climb at VZF plus 10 to 20 knots up to 3,000 feet. On reaching 900 meters, or 3,000 feet, above aerodrome level, transition to normal en route climb speed. Noise abatement procedures in the form of reduced power takeoff should not be required in adverse operating conditions such as contaminated runways, poor visibility, high crosswinds, wind shear, or thunderstorm activity. This completes the climb requirements for Class A aeroplanes. Focus on understanding and learning the segments for the takeoff climb. Knowing when each segment starts and stops, and what happens in each segment, forms a vital part of the ATPL performance exam. Ensure you can also accurately work through the climb performance graphs in CAP 698. Lastly, make sure you can detail the difference between the two noise abatement procedures. Don't forget, once you start your job with the airline, you will go through type training and line training. This will involve studying in a lot more detail the performance and procedures of the aeroplane you will fly, so that by the time you take your first passengers, you will feel a lot more comfortable with how the whole process works.